Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. So before I get into the video I'm responding to today, there's a short story as to why it's taken me so long to get to this video. You see, this video came out April 27th, 2018. And at the time I was having a lot of computer problems and couldn't render videos. But my intention at the time was actually to do a response. But by the time I got my computer working again, there were numerous other things for me to respond to, and I kind of forgot about it, to be honest. This happens occasionally, things slip through the cracks. And then when I published a video about a week or so ago, I noticed it was in the recommendations on the side, and I clicked on it, and suddenly I remembered I meant to respond to that video. So here I am, a little bit late, but I think it's worth responding to. And it should be easy to respond to, because even though I couldn't render videos at the time, I did leave an extremely long comment, complete with timestamps, tearing apart the argument of Big Joel. So, you know, I've kind of already got a script for this video, although no doubt I'll be adding lots of additional stuff as well. But considering this video has almost 270,000 views, it is worth responding to, even though I won't get anywhere near that many views. There are many arguments in this video which need to be debunked. So the video I'm responding to is The Red Pill, The Strange Art of Men's Rights Activism, Part 1 by Big Joel. I don't know if I'll go and eventually do Part 2 or not. I'll consider that down the road. But for now, I'm just doing this one. And with all that said, let's get stuck into it.
Hey everybody. Today, I'm going to talk about The Red Pill. Released in 2016, the documentary centers on a self-declared feminist, Cassie J, who enters the world of men's rights activism and slowly but surely gets convinced that the movement is a good one. It's hard to say the importance that the Red Pill has to men's rights activism at large. Hard to say the purpose the film has within that community or how widely it's been embraced. If I had to make an educated guess though, I would say that the movie serves two primary functions. First, it legitimizes and mainstreams the movement to some extent. I mean, if Cassie J, feminist extraordinaire, is able to change her ways and see the MRA light, then maybe they're not just a kinda silly fringe group after all. Second, the movie can function well as an entry point into Meninism.
An entry point into Meninism. Yes, talk about shooting yourself in the foot in less than 30 seconds. Well done, Big Joel. Well done. You've shown us in under a minute that you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Now, let me explain it to you like you're an idiot. Okay? Meninism is a parody of feminism. Okay? They're making fun of people like you by reversing the genders. They're not a human rights movement. They don't claim to be a human rights movement. They're not advocating for the human rights of men. They are not part of the men's rights movement. Okay? Whereas the men's rights movement actually does advocate for human rights and is a human rights movement. Do you see the difference, Joel? One is making fun of you, the other is a legitimate human rights movement. And if you don't understand the difference between what a Meninist and an MRA is, I would suggest that you need to do a lot more research before making videos like this one. Now, to be fair to Big Joel, he has at least watched the Red Pill movie, which is a lot more than some feminists I've criticised in the past who have done reviews of the movie without actually watching it. And no, I'm not joking. In case you haven't seen those videos, yes, there have been feminist reviews of the Red Pill movie from people who haven't even bothered watching it. But anyway, now that Big Joel has shot himself in the foot and shown that he doesn't really understand what he's talking about, let's move on to some straw manning that he does.
It makes so many claims and includes so many MRA talking points that the whole thing feels like a 101 course in that stuff. Men's rights activism is a relatively new phenomenon.
Actually, there have been numerous men's rights movements going back over 100 years, but the modern men's rights movement was started by Warren Farrell sometime in the 90s, so you're looking at 20 to 30 years ago. Now, more recently, say in the last 10 years, the men's rights movement has become somewhat more popular due to the internet and our ability to share information easily. We're no longer stuck going through the gatekeepers of the media, which tend to be either very traditional or very pro-feminist and not very men's rights friendly. So yes, it is true that, say, in the last 10 years, the men's rights movement really has gained a lot of traction and a lot of new members, including myself, but the movement itself isn't exactly new.
And this movie is only 2 years old. There's no telling if either will stand the test of time. But here, in this video, I want to assume one thing: that this film, and the movement it seems to represent, are important. Our culture has generated this movie, after all. It's created the circumstances under which it could be created and absorbed as a legible political perspective. And because of that, it only makes sense to look closely at the film, to talk about what it's trying to do, what ideas it wants to inspire, and what aesthetic composition it aims for. So that's this video, The Red Pill, the strange art of men's rights activism. One disclaimer: this movie goes to some pretty dark, pretty emotionally charged places, and so my video is gonna do that too. I'll be speaking about sexual assault, child abuse, suicide, intimate partner violence, and other such things. So, just know what you're getting into here. With that out of the way, let's get started. By and large, the Red Pill wants to support one main thesis: that the oppression men endure in America is on par with or greater than the oppression that women endure. And
I've heard the MRAs believe that they're the real oppressed ones argument 100 times. It appears in feminist articles about the men's rights movement constantly. And it comes from the notion that there can only be two types of people in society, according to feminists. There's the oppressive class and the oppressed class. And if MRAs are claiming that men have issues, that must mean that they're claiming that they're the oppressed class, which means that they must be claiming that feminists are oppressing them, or women are oppressing them. And then the feminist laughs at this insane notion that men could somehow be powerless and women could somehow have power and influence. Because in their mind, all men are powerful and all women are their victims. It's really a very toxic way of looking at the world and very unrealistic. The realistic way of looking at the world is that both men and women have issues. Some of those issues only affect women or affect women more than men, and some of those issues only affect men or affect men more than women. But it has nothing to do with one gender oppressing the other. However, one thing MRAs do like to bring up is that when women talk about their issues, they tend to get a lot of sympathy and understanding, and especially from governments who tend to pander towards the female vote. But men's issues tend to be ignored, or excused, or dismissed. Now, in my personal opinion, and I think most MRAs would agree with me, we don't agree that there is oppression in the West. Now, I guess it depends on how you define the word oppression. Personally, I think there are places in the world where people are oppressed, where they don't have human rights, they don't have free speech, they don't have political power or influence, and they are most definitely oppressed by dictatorships and government, military or police forces. I have no doubt that there are places like that in the world. I just don't think that describes the West. And I definitely don't think it describes women in the West.
because of that, it's ludicrous to think that our modern-day society privileges or empowers men over women. There are more nuances to it than that, of course, but it's my hope that we can get at these nuances and access the film's broader motivations by taking its thesis on its own terms. The movie brings up a lot of points, ranging from male circumcision to the negative media portrayal of men. But in this first video part, I just want to zoom in and do a close examination of the first major argument in the film, that various social scripts and economic conditions often result in men occupying roles that are harmful to them. This position is made clear by Warren Farrell, author of The Myth of Male Power.
Every society that survived based on its ability to train its sons to be disposable. Disposable in war as warriors, disposable in work as firefighters, as workers on oil rigs and so on, coal miners.
The Red Pill takes this sentiment and expands on it, generally trying to get the idea across that even as men are more enabled to produce under capitalism, that doesn't always lead to good things for them. The general idea is that the men who do hard labor in America are often seen as disposable or interchangeable.
Consider this, that 93% of workplace fatalities are men.
And on first blush, this argument seems deeply uncontroversial. After all, men do make up the vast majority of soldiers in America. Construction workers, truck drivers, commercial fishermen, all the dangerous jobs are mostly filled by men. The film spends a lot of time hammering this point home, too. It goes into great detail, showing statistics of casualties in American wars, and acting like those stats might be a surprise for some people. And yeah, okay. Men, especially poor men, the sorts of people who are forced to take dangerous jobs, are being systematically oppressed. I don't think a lot of people would disagree with that.
So, Joel is making some interesting arguments here. He's making the argument at the moment that the reason for the 93% of workplace deaths being male statistic is because poor men are forced into dangerous jobs. Now, there is some truth in that. But Joel is trying to reframe it as not a male issue, but as a capitalist issue. It's really the fault of capitalism, not the fault of gender stereotypes or unfair pressure on men or anything like that. And this is an argument that we see repeated in his comment section from his viewers. But in a little while, Joel is about to make the argument that there are more women in poverty than men. I'll be having some more to say about that in a little while, don't worry about that. But if that's the case, then these two arguments don't really go together, do they? If men working dangerous jobs is the result of poverty, and there are more women in poverty than men, then surely there should be more women working dangerous jobs, right? Unless, of course, we bring gender into it, and different expectations put on males and females. And those expectations are not put on men just by other men, but by women as well.
But here, I want to show you a scene, one brought to us by none other than Cassie J. The scene, a snippet of Cassie's super-secret video diary, expresses this really interesting idea toward the beginning.
Men are, they're given medals and statues and written in the history books to justify them dying and being slaves to work or being used to progress societies.
Geez, what a statement. Cassie is essentially sending up two institutions at once. She starts with nationalism, claiming that young boys are wrongly inundated with ideas of romance, heroism, and patriotism that ultimately convince them to sacrifice their lives. She then extends this critique to capitalism, implying that just as soldiers are deluged with propaganda, so too are workers. They're convinced, by a system that doesn't care about them, that their labor isn't just necessary, but also noble and heroic. And that's pretty bold right there. There's a lot of meat on those two sentences. But as interesting as they are, Cassie finishes her statement with this. I'm just going to play the whole thing, even though it's a bit long.
And I've believed for so long that I'm at a disadvantage for being a woman, and that I have to work harder than everyone else, and I have more to overcome, and I have more to prove just because of my gender. But the MRAs are saying that this is all a lie, and that guys are actually the ones that are disadvantaged and discriminated against. And actually, the more I learn from him, the more I think, thank God I wasn't born a guy. Because I don't think that the expectations on men is good or healthy. I mean, they have so much pressure to succeed and to be strong and to stand up and protect others and to put their lives on the line. I don't think I would want that responsibility.
So, I have a few issues with what's going on here. To start, I'm not sold on the idea that because men occupy the most dangerous jobs, their quality of life is de facto worse.
Once again, Joel misses the point. Why am I not surprised? Okay, so why do MRAs bring up workplace deaths? After all, aren't men choosing to work in those industries? Well, first of all, there's the expectation that men should be the provider-protector role, which means that men are more likely to put themselves in those positions. But the other reason why we bring it up, and this is the reason that seems to have gone completely over Joel's head, even though I think Cassie J clearly spelled it out, is because we're trying to counter the feminist argument that men's lives are on easy mode and that women have to work 10 times as hard just to break even with a man. That's simply not the case. And the reason why feminists tend to think this is because feminists are pretty much blind to the men at the bottom. They tend to only see the men at the top. They're constantly talking about the fact that the vast majority of the world's leaders and CEOs are male, while ignoring the men doing the shitty and dangerous jobs. There's a word for this. It's called the apex fallacy, where they only see the men at the top and then generalize about all men. And in fact, there's another term in reference to this called the glass cellar. Feminists often talk about the glass ceiling and not being able to break through, but ignore the glass cellar, which is referring to those shitty, dangerous jobs which most of them don't even consider touching. So these are things that we should be talking about, Joel. If we're talking about equality and men and women being treated equally, then we need to examine the positives and negatives that affect both genders, instead of only looking at the advantages that one gender has and generalizing, and then looking at the disadvantages that the other gender has and generalizing, and concluding that one is oppressing the other. That's simply not reality.
She says she wouldn't want to take on the responsibilities or obligations of maleness. And there, it seems like she's comparing herself, a white, well-to-do artist without children, to poor working-class men, and saying, I'd rather be me than be one of those guys. While I am happy that Jay seemingly lives a pleasant, unburdened life, it's a bit strange that she seems to extend that sentiment to all womanhood. More now than ever before, women also have to work in order to sustain their families. And I think the conditions under which women enter capitalism are substantially worse than those that men face. Women are more likely to be single mothers. Over 12% of women live in poverty, while the number is under 10% for men.
Women are more likely to be single mothers. Yeah, it's amazing you caught that fact, Joel, that there aren't a lot of men who are single mothers. What can I say? Clearly, it's gender stereotypes, preventing men from becoming single mothers. I'm glad we have you to point out things like that, Joel. Oh, by the way, the term you're looking for, Joel, is single parent. Okay? The fact that you refer to single parents as single mothers, I think shows a little bit of bias on your part, don't you think, mate? But seriously, Cassie J isn't generalizing about all women. She's talking about her own perspective. Now, it's ironic that Joel accuses her of talking for all women because that's what feminists do all the time. They generalize about all women and generalize about all men. Once again, referring back to the apex fallacy. Now, Joel does bring up that women are more likely to live in poverty than men, and he does have a citation. So, Joel's citation is from the National Women's Law Centre and their national Snapshot, Poverty Amongst Women and Families. Now, having looked through this citation, there is a clear pattern here. The reason that more women are in poverty than men is because more women are single parents. And if you're a single parent, then you're less likely to work a full-time job. In fact, you're probably working part-time or are on some form of government benefits. And if that's the case, you are obviously going to have less income than a family with 2 working parents or someone who's working full-time. Now, I could suggest that one solution to this might be more shared custody. Surely if both parents had shared custody, then that would enable both parents to work a more equal amount of hours, right? What a shame there are feminist groups fighting against this. But the vast majority of women in this category do have a roof over their heads, in many cases a roof supplied by the government. Yet if we look at statistics for the homeless, well, that's a very different story, isn't it?
And when it comes to extreme poverty, the differential is 6.1% of women versus 4.4% of men. That's a difference of roughly 2 million people.
Yet when it comes to homelessness, we have about 80% men and special services for women, right?
You might notice that I'm sort of playing small ball with the red pill here. You know, you say that men have it bad. Well, check out how bad women have it. But see, it's that kind of reductive discourse that the film demands. And that's because, in this scene, Cassie J implicates a pretty strange notion that the only metric we can use to understand oppression is quality of life. This entire section of the movie seems to center on that idea, claiming that because some men have bad, dangerous jobs, that they are necessarily less liberated than women who don't have those jobs.
Once again, Big Joel misses the point. It goes completely over his head. I'm guessing because of his ideological bias. The point that the movie is trying to make is that men's lives are not perfect, that men are not privileged, that men have issues too. Therefore, we should talk about everyone's issues, including men's. Alternatively, the feminist narrative, which we see from some of the feminists actually interviewed in the movie, is that men are privileged, men are advantaged. So all our efforts need to focus on women and just women. And when men bring up their issues, they're just the privileged, whining man babies who are crying because their privilege is slowly being eroded. Let me stress once again, when you only look at the advantages of one gender and the disadvantages of the other, you are not looking at reality. You are looking at a bias representation of reality. When MRAs bring up the issues that men face, we're not saying that men are oppressed more than women. We're saying that the feminist view of the world is bullshit, and men have issues too that need to be discussed and talked about and taken seriously.
You hear about patriarchy, right? All the evils of the world's from patriarchy, but we're the ones dying, you know? And we die for you guys, you know, to protect our families, our friends.
In every society that's ever existed, women have had privilege and protection that men did not.
But here's the thing. Quality of life is not the be-all and end-all when it comes to discussing oppression. There are other metrics that are just as important. Where does the wealth in a society concentrate? Who can decide what gets made and how it gets made? Who holds most of the political power? That is...
Well, if you're talking about a Western democracy, Joel, then that would be women, because women make up the majority of the population, and they also make up the majority of the voters. Now, sure, most of the people which are elected to political positions are male, but they're there to represent the population. I recently pointed out in another video how politicians, yes, even male politicians, pander to the female electorate, so I'm not going to do it again here. But as for spending, yes, it is true that men make most of the money, but women spend most of the money. So where is the wealth actually concentrated then, Joel?
Who's putting our laws on the books? What decisions are individuals able to make, and how are those decisions impacted by a wider network of power? Neither the Red Pill nor Cassie J seem to care about these questions, and because of that, their read of American culture becomes very simplistic. Let me be a bit more concrete. Women don't just not want the dangerous jobs that men have. Rather, they have been historically barred from those positions, and they continue to face undue persecution in male-dominated fields. Let's just take one example that the film seems to care a lot about: the military. It should be obvious to anyone watching this movie that its war casualty stats don't exist in a vacuum. 99% of the people who died in World War II were men, but that's not a coincidence, right? Women didn't have the choice or the obligation to serve their country at the time.
Now this is an argument I've often heard from feminists, and it's quite easy to debunk. Look, I agree with Joel that women and trans people should be given the choice to serve in the military just like men, okay? I fully agree with that. But you can't compare people not being given the choice to serve in the military to people being forced to serve in the military. Which one is the greater crime? Sure, it's unfair that some women in World War II might have wanted to go and fight the Nazis and they weren't given that opportunity, but what about the men who were forced to do it and were either physically or mentally broken by it? Which is the greater crime? Which do you think has the greater cost, Joel? It's a simple question.
They were prevented from doing so by a male-run government, and echoes of this historical discrimination still exist in our culture. After all, it was only in the last 5 years that women were allowed to enter combat, and female presence in the military is still a contentious issue. Mike Pence, a man who might one day be president, has gone on record saying that women should not be allowed to serve.
You do realise that MRAs either want the draft scrapped entirely or it to apply equally to both men and women, which is something that not all feminists agree with, I know. But I'm not exactly sure why you're bringing up Mike Pence, considering he's not an MRA and he doesn't represent us. Sure, there's white male politicians who are against women serving in the military. I'm not exactly sure what that has to do with our position on the topic, though.
More than just discrimination, though, women soldiers face a host of issues that are much less pronounced among their male counterparts. While sexual assault is a large problem throughout the military, women report very high numbers. 80% of servicewomen have been sexually harassed, and upwards of 25% have been assaulted. So, this is the point I'm getting at here. If women could enter the military under more equitable conditions, would they, on aggregate, have a higher quality of life? I don't know the answer to that. I'm not a future magician, and neither is Cassie J. Every social shift has upsides and downsides, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert on the subject. But regardless of what that answer might be, the historical barring of women from service and the continued systematic oppressions that women in the army face are just that, oppressions. They don't become liberating because serving in the military isn't fun. But what strikes me most about Cassie J's monologue isn't that it's unconvincing, not that it's a reductive point in a reductive film, but that it doesn't make any sense, like in an emotional way. Let me read to you again what Jay says at the beginning of this scene. Men are given medals and statues and written about in the history books to justify them dying or being slaves to work or being used to progress society. Now, if I told you that quote without any context, what would you think the takeaway might be? From my perspective, it's easy. Society is flawed, and there are some pretty major ways we have to fix it. Maybe we shouldn't allow the government to glamorize war in the way it does. Maybe we shouldn't be enlisting 18-year-old children to fight our international conflicts. Maybe we should take some pain to make sure that people doing labor are not physically or economically abused. Here's Jay's takeaway, though. Men have it worse than women do. And she just stops there. Never provides any more insight into the root of the problems.
Yes, so Big Joel entirely misses her point. Her point was, before talking to MRAs, she had not considered the male perspective of things, the male side of things, the fact that men don't have it easy, the fact that men sacrifice. She was of the opinion, which we hear all the time from feminists, that being male is privilege, that being male is living life on easy mode. And now that she was faced with the other side of the equation, that she was shown additional information that she hadn't seen before, she started to change her perspective. And she started to realize that, you know what, men don't have it great. That in some areas they do have it tough, and there are expectations on men which are unfair. And that it's not all one-sided. It's not the world against women, but instead it's issues that both men and women have. And in some cases, those issues are similar or the same, and in other cases they're completely different. But it's not this male privilege, living life on easy mode bullshit, while the poor women are oppressed and treated like chattel. Ideological crap that we get all the time from feminists, especially right throughout the media. But that point has been completely missed by you, Joel, or possibly purposely missed. And instead you've redirected it towards socialism and, as we're about to see in a little while, gun control, because you're doing anything you can to take away from the message of the movie, which is men have issues too. It reminds me a bit of a debate I saw years ago between an MRA and I think it was a YouTuber called Big Lundy, who was a feminist. I'm not sure if he still makes videos. But the MRA brought up male infant circumcision, and Big Lundy very bluntly said, that's not a male issue, and he was serious. He seriously was putting forward male infant circumcision as not a male issue. And in all seriousness, he said, it's a children's issue. Now, sure, it affects male children, but apparently it's not a male issue, because admitting that men have issues kind of starts to erode the feminist message that it's women who are the oppressed ones by the evil, privileged men, right? So you have to recontextualize everything in such a way that it's not a men's issue at all. And these silly MRAs just don't realize it.
Or act as though there could be a solution. See, Jay starts with a criticism of society, substitutes that for a criticism of feminism, and then never really comes back to that society angle. And in theory, that could be fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with criticizing the left or criticizing feminism. The only problem is that the progressive movements that the film takes issue with are really just not the enemy here.
Really, Big Joel? I mean, you have watched the movie, right? You have seen the feminists in the movie basically dismissing not only the men's rights movement, but men's rights issues. You have seen that, right? Maybe have a look at the media online and the way they constantly demonize MRAs or minimize and dismiss men's issues. Maybe consider some of the protests that we see in the movie, shutting down talks about male suicide. But somehow you're trying to convince us that these people are not our enemy. Really, Joel? Yep, that's going to take a lot of convincing.
In fact, those movements advocate pretty good solutions to at least some of the problems this movie brings up. Let's just take two examples. First, male suicidality. Paul Elam says at one point that men are 4 times more likely to kill themselves than are women.
4 of 5 suicides are men.
He throws that out there without any added information. To him, it's just another way that men have it worse, which can be used to prove feminism stupid.
Are you serious, Big Joel? So, when we try to bring awareness about male suicide to the public and bring up a male issue, that's somehow a criticism of feminism and saying feminism is stupid. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there are feminists out there who do criticize us for bringing up male suicide. Apparently, that's a bad thing. People who advocate for the rights of men being concerned about the high male suicide rate is apparently proof that we're bad people. Mind you, these same people often claim that we actually do nothing to support men and men's issues. But, you know, they're not very consistent in their argumentation, are they?
But why do men kill themselves more? Well, the consensus seems to be that male suicide rates are higher because men choose more lethal methods, most commonly guns. Suicide is generally a very spontaneous act. If a convenient method isn't available, a lot of people won't do it at all. Because of that, it's reasonable to think that if we limited the number of guns in people's homes, they would commit suicide less.
Well, that's an amazing analysis of the problem there, Joel. I guess if you're right, then the suicide rates in, say, some place like my home of Australia, where there is strict gun control, it should be closer to 50-50, right? Oh, look at that. It's still predominantly men, isn't it? But, maybe Australia is just a statistic abnormality, Let's look at somewhere else which has strict gun control, like the UK. So I'm guessing male and female suicide rates in the UK would be pretty similar. Oh no, they're not, are they? No. Now, look, I do think Joel's point is somewhat valid, that if a gun is available, then yes, someone is more likely to use it. But even when we remove that factor, we find that male suicide is still vastly higher than female suicide. So it is more than the simplistic guns are bad argument. But, this is Joel's way of once again distracting from the point, right? Instead of talking about the issues affecting men, for example, like how male suicide spikes after a divorce and a father loses access to his kids. No, it's much easier for Joel to distract us and talk about how guns are bad. And for the record, Joel, I'm glad I live in a country which doesn't have as many guns as America. So I thought I'd just say that, just in case you watch this and want to straw man me as somehow being pro-gun. That's not the point. The point is you're using your anti-gun stance as a distraction from actual men's issues.
And the statistics seem to bear out on this one. In nations where gun control was tightened, like Israel or Australia, suicide rates dropped precipitously.
Yet still vastly more men commit suicide in Australia than women, Joel. That's just a fact. So it has to be more than just guns, right?
In Connecticut, when gun laws were made stricter, there was a 15% decrease in firearm-related suicide and little increase in other forms. And when Missouri loosened their gun laws, firearm suicides increased by 16%. I'm not saying here that if we did a better job at regulating guns, there would be no suicide problem. But I think the question has to be asked. Which movement causes more American men to die by their own hands? The NRA or the left and feminism?
Why can't both be somewhat responsible, Joel? I will admit that easy access to guns makes suicide a lot easier for a lot of men. That's obvious. But that isn't the only issue, or even the most important issue. What we need to do is to find out what causes suicide. And there's many, many different things that cause suicide. And yes, feminism and the left is somewhat responsible for that. Now, I'm not going to lay all the blame at the feet of feminism or the left, nor will I blame everyone on the left or every feminist. But you guys do have to take some responsibility. When you constantly demonize males and masculinity, when you constantly refer to males as toxic, when you constantly blame everything on men, when you constantly dismiss men's issues and tell them that they're whining, crying man babies and that they're really privileged, when you ignore men's issues, when you prevent men from having access to their children, when you demonize boys and teach them that they're bad, are you honestly telling me, Joel, that none of this has any effect on the male suicide rates? Not any effect whatsoever.
It seems like the answer is the former, so why does the movie target the latter? Why does Paul Elam say this?
4 of 5 suicides are men.
And then claim that this guy is the best president since Abraham Lincoln.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick, if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. But
it just doesn't add up. Let's move on to my second example, because it's like way out there. At one point, Paul Elam says this:
Imagine what it takes to be a successful politician. Imagine how much of your personal life that you give up, how much you work, how much privacy that you sacrifice, how much freedom in your day-to-day life that goes out the window. There are more men willing to do those things than there are women.
Let's think about the argument here. Elam is claiming that people are mentally strained by the act of ruling the nation, and since the vast majority of people making the laws are men, that's a pretty substantial amount of labor right there. But if we look closely at this position for even a second, we can see how well it fits within the quote-unquote feminist agenda. On one hand, we have men, and those men are forced into serving the nation because of the burden to produce or whatever. On the other, we have feminists, and they're saying, we want to be in government, we should encourage more women to be in government, and we should vote for them. Any way you slice it, this problem can be solved with the most common sense, sort of left-leaning solution out there. More representation, more kinds of people running the country.
Okay, so I guess the question is, why are there less women in politics? Or why are there less women running for politics? Now, the feminist answer to this is women are prevented or dissuaded from running for politics by the patriarchy and by men. They even go as far as to say that calling a young girl bossy will somehow prevent her from becoming president of the United States.
Pushy. Stubborn. Pushy. Stubborn. Bossy. Bossy.
When I was growing up, I was called bossy.
I think the word bossy is just a squasher.
Oh, by the way, but it's perfectly fine to call young boys toxic. That's perfectly fine. That has no negative effect on boys. But, you know, we can't call young girls bossy because that will destroy their future. Now, there is an alternative view to this, and it's one surprisingly supported by feminists from a certain point of view. Not directly, but, you know, if we look at it from a certain point of view, then yes, feminists do actually support it. So what do I mean by that? Okay, we often hear from feminists that men need to express their emotions more, that men are too stoic, and this is largely one of the causes of male suicide, and there is some truth in this. But essentially what they're saying when they're saying that men are less emotional than women, or men are more stoic, or men show their emotions less, what they're essentially saying is that women are more emotional. And if you're more emotional and your entire life is put on public display and you have every single aspect of that life picked apart and you're constantly criticized and put down by your opposition, that's going to eat away at you. Now, there are plenty of female politicians out there who are stoic, and they cope with the public scrutiny and criticism perfectly well. But there are many, many women who would not cope with that very well. And to be perfectly fair, there are many men who wouldn't cope with that very well either. In fact, I think the vast majority of the population, be they male or female, would not cope with that level of scrutiny. But I do think there is a higher percentage of males than females who are capable of coping with that. Now, if we look at online abuse, for example, males are more likely to be abused online, but females are more likely to take it seriously. I think this is a similar thing. I think because men tend to be more stoic and women tend to be more emotional, women are more likely to take criticism or abuse to heart and have it affect them on an emotional level. Now, to be clear, I am generalizing here, but we are talking about general trends amongst males and females. And to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying that women should not be politicians. But if you look at someone like Margaret Thatcher, she really wasn't the type of person who would claim that she has PTSD from Twitter. Now, for the record, that's not saying I agree with her politics. I'm simply judging her by the fact that she was more stoic like a typical male politician. So I have to wonder, if we constantly tell women that they're victims of society, of the patriarchy, of men, is that making them stronger? Is that making them more stoic? Is that making them more compatible with being a politician? I would say no, it's not. Okay, what about we change society so politicians don't have to be so stoic, that they can be more emotional? Yeah, I can't see that working. Especially considering the way the left have attacked Donald Trump constantly. It seems that they're not supporting that position, right? At least when it's someone they disagree with. So I think the answer is, if you want more female politicians, then you have to teach females to man up. Now, I'm not saying that that is a positive thing. There are dire consequences of the term man up. But when you're talking about really tough jobs that require you to man up and put aside your personal feelings or your emotions despite the negative consequences, then yeah, that's the requirement.
But, of course, Paul Elam doesn't say that. And when he's talking about male suicide, of course he doesn't bring up gun control. And why is that? Well, I think the answer is simple. The Red Pill and its participants do not want its audience to follow the film's political suggestions to their logical conclusions. Because if they did, they would see a very different story from the one this film tells us. A story where the left and feminism aren't concealing the truth of male oppression.
Really, Big Joel? Because whenever we bring up men's issues, we are constantly given excuses as to why they're not important or shouldn't be dealt with, or it's just men doing it to men anyway, so, it's not important, or female issues are more important, or men have all the rights anyway, so why do you need MRAs? Or feminism will get around to fixing it eventually, after we fix all the female issues first. Like mansplaining and manspreading, much more important than male suicide. We need to tackle those ones first, and eventually we'll do something about, men killing themselves at such high numbers, etc., etc., etc. We are constantly given excuses as to why men's issues are non-important or less important, or we find that the feminist is giving us distractions. It's not male suicide, which is really the issue, it's gun control. If only we focused on the NRA instead of the demonization of males and masculinity, then surely that would solve the problem, right? It's not that men find their identity in being providers and protectors, and that has some negative consequences on males and masculinity, and maybe those men should be appreciated for their sacrifice. No, it's nothing to do with that. It's actually to do with capitalism taking advantage of poor men. And of course, then there are those feminists who just want to shut us down and don't want us talking at all in any way whatsoever. And they do this through numerous methods. One, of course, is actually turning up at events and pulling fire alarms and shouting us down, and more recently throwing milkshakes at us. But there are other ways too, constantly writing articles claiming that we inspire mass shooters, which is bullshit, or that we're pro-rape, or numerous other lies which are constantly told about us. All these things mean that you are not our friends. All these things mean that you do not support us. All these things mean that we are not on the same side. Now, if you want to actually support men's rights and fix men's issues, then maybe you should speak out against these things that I've mentioned, and maybe not do them yourself, right? Just a suggestion. Maybe then we can find some middle ground.
See that in many cases, MRAs ought to align with these movements. So what I've done here is sort of drawn out a map that we can use to understand this first set of arguments. First, the film presents a bunch of statistics that refer to a valid problem. Men, especially poor men, are oppressed by the conditions of their labor. Second, it employs a narrative that disregards female problems and paints the world of oppression as though it has no history or complexity. Men have it worse than women do.
Yeah, totally misses the point of the entire movie. In fact, Cassie J says numerous times that just because we're talking about men's issues doesn't mean that we're not saying women don't have issues too. But for some reason, people like Joel, whenever they hear men have issues too, or men have issues also, suddenly they hear men only have issues, which is strange. It's a strange way of interpreting the world. And in fact, Cassie J talks about this in her TED Talk. I won't play the clip here because I've used it in numerous videos in the past. But basically, she said that before she started making this movie, she had the attitude that whenever a man brought up a men's issue, she kind of dismissed it and said that, women's issues are more important, and would interpret that as the man saying that somehow only men have issues, or men's issues are somehow more important. And it took her some time to realize that that's not what we were saying at all. But this is clearly the consequence of having the worldview that everything is oppressor and oppressed. That is the black and white dynamic which drives the entire world. When you view the world through that feminist lens, it's hard to listen to what MRAs are actually saying without reinterpreting it to women don't have issues at all, or men's issues are only the important ones. Because that's the way feminists think about female issues. They're projecting their bias onto us.
Third, it presents this point in such a way that it can make the people who agree with the movie feel like their problems are not cared about by the mainstream. Men are disposable, nobody's talking about it, and the world of feminist politics seeks to hide these problems. And what's nuts is that at this point, I've only talked about the first 30 minutes of the red pill. There's a lot more complexity and nuance left to come, and a lot of questions left unanswered. So I hope you'll join me next time.
Now, as I said at the start of this video, I did leave a very, very long, detailed rebuttal to Big Joel's talking points in the comments section, and Big Joel did respond. He said, "This film actively pursues the message that feminism is an overinflated, obsolete ideology that people shouldn't advocate. Cassie herself ends the film not by saying feminism ought to change, but rather, I'm not a feminist. It would be hard to take this idea seriously if women had problems that were substantially greater than those men face." Okay, couple of points here that we need to discuss. Firstly, yes, it is true Cassie did say that she's no longer a feminist. She has also said numerous times that she's not an MRA, and that both men and women's issues should be tackled. And for the record, I'm perfectly fine with that. I don't think everyone needs to identify as an MRA to care about men's issues. However, it seems that Big Joel thinks that the only way to tackle women's issues is if you use the label feminist. It doesn't matter if you want to fix the issues affecting women. No, that's not the important part. The important part is that you use the label feminist, even if you aren't doing anything helpful, apparently. And that seems to be what he's offended over, the fact that she no longer uses the title feminist, that she's no longer part of the club, or should I say cult. Effectively, he's offended that she's a heretic. And no, that's not hyperbole. So, yeah, just to finish off, Joel, just let me point out the fact that people can care about female issues and can actually advocate for those issues without being part of your cult, okay? Now, my intention to finish off the video was to go through some of the comments in the comment section of Big Joel's video, but this video's already run pretty long, so I'm only going to respond to one of them, but I will put the others up on the screen afterwards, and you can pause and read them yourself, the last two of which are directly replying to my large comment. But the one comment I do want to reply to says this. MRAs points out the pitfalls of the patriarchal society, such as men having to provide for the family. MRAs provide absolutely no solution to this. Yeah, well, I guess you've got us there.
Lack of purpose. When I was a boy, we basically had two senses of purpose. You were either a warrior or you were a sole breadwinner. But as divorces occurred, male-female relationships got shook up, and boys and the feminist movement came in, and they did a wonderful thing, which was they expanded girls' sense of purpose from the old raise children only to being able to raise children, raise money, or do some combination of both. But no one stepped in and helped expand boys' sense of purpose in an equivalent way. Instead, boys were told, earn money, earn money, earn money, or alternatively, be a loser. The women's movement and the society helped create affirmative action to introduce women to professions they hadn't been comfortable with, such as the STEM professions, so science, technology, engineering, and math. But no one introduced boys to the caring professions. So one possible solution to the purpose void is to expand boys' sense of purpose, to consider the option of being a full-time dad, an elementary school teacher, a social worker, a nurse. We even have to say words like male nurse. Or we can look at, more broadly, the creation of a larger White House Council on Boys and Men in the way that we already have a White House Council on Women and Girls to address the 10-plus causes of the boy crisis.
So, yeah, this commenter is 100% correct. If you purposely ignore all the times that we do offer solutions, some of which I've even offered in this video, if you ignore all those times that we offer solutions, then, yeah, they're right. We offer no solutions. Yeah. All it takes is just a little bit of editing of reality, you know, and there you go. She's got us. Anyway, get your pause buttons ready for these comments.
I'm gonna show you a good side. You're gonna like this. Black makes a lot of